a negative 1 times A. Also A times negative 1. So a negative A, or negative, any negative number, you take any negative number, you can factor out a negative 1. Negative 1 can be factored out of it. That's what they equal. So this number equals that entire expression, negative 1, factored out of that number. We factor it out of A. So here, A equals any number. A equals 1 times A, and a negative A equals a negative 1 times A. Meaning for any positive number, I can factor out a positive 1. For any negative number, I can factor out a negative 1. A negative 1 can be factored out of that. So if we have a negative 1, that equals negative 1 times 1. Or 1 times a negative 1. Negative 2 equals negative 1 times 2. And here, this is the same for variables or terms. If I have a term, let's say I have the term negative x. It equals negative 1 times x. If I can factor out a negative 1 from this. Any negative term or a negative number is treated as a term that has been multiplied by a scalar factor of negative 1. So this is why we do this. I could take, let's say if I had a number negative 2x. This can be separated a number of ways. First, you can separate the negative 2 and the x. Because this is the product of negative 2 and x. Negative 2x. You can multiply them. And then, I can separate the negative 1 from this 2. So I have negative 1 times 2 times x. And here are my factors. So here, for negative 2x, you can have 3 factors of that. You have a negative 1, you got a 2, and you have x. Another important thing that needs to be shown is the, so you have these 2 laws, and the third important law that we have to, or I want to get into right away is dividing a number by 1, where A still equals any number. Any number can be written as that number divided by 1. That simply means A divided by 1. But I don't use this, I don't usually use this symbol, this division symbol, because it's really just the same thing as that. These 2 dots represent numbers that you will put there. What that symbol means. And then this is the dividing bar. So I don't use it. Because it means that. And this is more simple to work with. That's the law. Write it down. It should be in your notes. These three laws you should know it. If a equals any number, a equals 1 times a negative a equals negative 1 times a, and a can be written as a divided by 1, or a equals a divided by 1, or a equals a over 1. This here is read as a over 1. Or a divided by 1. I like to say a over 1. If I have terms in this form, in what you call a fraction, but mathematicians call it a rational expression, an irrational form. If you have terms in the form of a rational form, we call that we say the numerator over the denominator. We say the word over instead of saying divided by. But both are correct. That's the third form law you need to know. Any number divided by 1 equals that same number. So dividing a number by 1, divide a by 1, that won't change the number. Dividing a number by 1 does not change the number. And the importance of this is to show you that any number, so we have the number 22. 22 equals 22 over 1. The importance of that, don't just also means 22 divided by 1. That's not really useful for you. Even in arithmetic, you still put them in a different form. You still do like this. Say 22 divided by 1, and then you work with that. This form is not useful. It's not useful. I don't know why. And if you're a teacher, if you're an educator, you should also teach. You should teach your children not to use that symbol in their calculations. If you're given that, write it. But we know what it means. But we don't use. It's not useful for anything because you can't work with it. In arithmetic, you would have 20. This equals 22 over 1. That's in an algebra. 22 over 1. That's a fractional form, and I can work with that. So I have the number. So this is the algebraic form. You put in a fraction, and then here, that's 22 divided by 1. I don't use this symbol here because it's not useful for. I can't work with that. If you figure out a way to work with it, and then somebody email me, and then I might teach how to do that. But it doesn't work for anything. It's just a symbol. Can't use it for anything. So I don't use it because it's not useful. But you need to know that you can take terms and put them in a rational form by dividing it by 1. You're going to have to do that in your algebra study. It's the basic lesson, but you're going to have to know that. If I have a variable, or any variable, x equals x divided by 1, it does not change the number or the term of the variable. If I have, let's say I have xy, that equals xy divided by 1. It does not change the number. It doesn't change it. Where x over y equals xy. Even if I start off with a fraction, let's say I start off with 4/5. 4/5 equals 4/5 divided by 1. You see? And then that